access to electricity and track the success or the failure every single year. This is very important to track the success or not. If you say, generally we have problem, this and that, you are not able to see how the policies, whether the policies are successful or not. So, my first point is we have to be very serious about measuring the success or failure. That's number one. Second point is, when we talk about the access to energy, we mainly talk about access to electricity. But there is the other hallmark of the energy poverty, which is lack of access to clean cooking fuels. Today, 2.6 billion people have no access to clean cooking and using wood, agricultural waste, animal waste for cooking purposes, which in turn leads to problems, health problems, indoor pollution, especially for women, as they are the cooking at home, and children. So, numbers are important. Second thing is, it is not only access to electricity, but also access to clean cooking. This is another problem as well. This is number one. Number two, I am saying this as a head of an international organization, but while I am very happy that the G20, United Nations, have goals, recommendations, and taking this issue seriously, which is what we are working for, to have the targets there, to have the agreement there, to have the communiques there, is only a start. Unless this momentum is not turned into real action by the governments, those nice communiques and the targets remain where they are. So therefore, to have the agreements and targets and goals is only a start of a multinational momentum, and if they are not transformed into real government actions, their effectiveness is rather limited. I want to also underline that. Number three, and the last one. Now, there are excellent examples of bringing electricity to everybody. I will give you one country, China. China, in my view, in the whole history of energy, made a big revolution, another one, which is in 11 years, China brought electricity to 500 million people. I'm talking 500 million, half a billion people. It was a government policy, clear target, and make the policies there. Very simple. But there are some other countries who are going very, very, very slowly. So here, two things I wanted to mention. One, we are going to rely more and more off-grid solutions because, as Minister Maximus mentioned, the access to electricity in the urban centers are easier, but the last mile he mentioned in general concept, for the rural areas, it is much more difficult, and the off-grid solutions and the renewables are very important here. This number one. Number two, perhaps a point for discussion. Now, I wish all the electricity plants, power plants built to solve this problem were low-carbon solutions. But if a poor country chooses not the lowest carbon solution, goes for a higher carbon solution, as it is the most economic solution for that very country, we cannot blame that country. I am very open here. It's a very imperative of that countries to have access to electricity rather than thinking the CO2 emissions in the 2050. It's an imperative of that country. It's a survival issue. So if the international community is serious about that issue, need to provide solution to the government in order to make the better choices. In the absence of this international effort, we cannot blame any developing country to go for the least cost option for themselves and to go for it. So therefore, in my view, international organizations, we have to have one standard only and follow that line. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, you talked about setting goals and targets, and I think it's great now to be able to go to Girish Pradhan. So India is one of the poster childs of success in terms of sort of rapid improvement in recent years. Obviously, we talked about China as well. So I follow your power minister on Twitter. My Hindi's not so good, but even in English, I can work out how many villages are being connected by the month. So talk to us a little bit about maybe goal setting and target setting, but how you're doing. I've seen some villages with LPG stoves recently, but how's it going?
Well, just to start off, as far as energy access is concerned, it's the most crucial goal as far as India is concerned. And I do believe that energy access is the cornerstone of energy security. No country can call itself energy secure unless it provides the energy access. Now, energy access is as an objective, an overriding objective, was not only accepted, but was keenly underscored by the new government. And they've, over the last 2 years, if I may borrow a phrase, put their money where their mouth is. And basically it started with what Fatih was mentioning in terms of actually evaluating and enumerating what it is that's lacking. What are the numbers there and what would be required in terms of providing access? We have something like around 170 million rural households. I'm looking at rural because the main focus of universal access, energy access, is more in terms of rural. There are problems with urban, but those can be dealt with, as Fatih also mentioned. So rural is the main area, and it's around 170 million households, out of which 60 million households right now don't have access. Now, what the present government did as soon as it came was to sit down with the states. As you know, we are a federal setup. Our states are very strong, and they have to be brought on the same table. So the central government, the federal government, and the states sat together, and they carried out a comprehensive study of what kind of demand there was likely to be, what were the constraints in terms of transmission, distribution, etc., and broke these up into targets that were then accepted by both the sides. And given the overall picture that emerged, the present national goal is to provide energy access for the whole country by 2019. Come January 2019, we intend to do that. We have around 8,000 villages which still are not connected. We also have a problem in terms of the villages in India being not a compact block. There are hamlets, or there are habitations which are sort of satellites to that main village. So earlier, if you just look at the definition of rural electrification over the years, over the last 40 years, you will find that from an electrification definition which said that if a pole and a wire crossed the village, that village was electrified, to the present, which says that unless you provide a household, every household in the village with electricity, and actually the power flows. That's very crucial, because we've had a lot of cases where the wires were drawn, but there was no power flowing. And it led to, as you know, de-electrification, and you had to start all over again. So these are some of the issues, and 2019 is the target. Now, I'm going to be a little, sort of odd man out here, because I'm a regulator. And I look at what is the regulator likely to do in terms of supporting this particular move towards energy access. And I'll pick up something that Fatih mentioned, and so did the Honorable Minister there, in terms of off-grid solutions and renewable energy solutions for remote rural areas. Now, what the regulators have tried to do in India is to give confidence, because we found that the private sector, the entrepreneurs, were afraid of coming into these areas, obviously because the main grid was likely to hit this particular rural complex within, say, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, I mean, a short while. So all the investment would go. So we try to give them comfort through a regulation which allows for the off-grid solution to work after the grid has come. Then the second area that we did support access was in terms of our regulations for rooftop. So we've now rolled out our regulations for rooftop in terms of net metering, gross metering, and these are very much in the public domain. This is going to be supportive of a target of almost 40 gigawatts on rooftop by the year 2020, 2021. So this is also supportive. We've also come up with a draft regulation on a hybrid solution. In many parts of India, you have solar and wind potential, and most importantly, you do have biomass. Wherever you have a biomass solution with a solar or small hydro, you could have a hybrid solution which could work. So this is broadly the areas that we are looking at. Let me end by just saying that nothing makes sense, and I'm not being, I'm not making just a light-hearted statement. Nothing makes sense if a country doesn't provide electricity to every citizen, man, woman, or child. Thank you.
No, thank you very much indeed. And I think there's this point that the distributed solution will live alongside and in an integrated way with the grid going forward is something that's being, all the evidence is that that's what's interesting and exciting and actually builds resilience into systems in the developed and in the developing world. So maybe something for the conversation as we go forward. So nothing makes sense unless a country provides power for its people. Perhaps we should go to our hosts to round out this panel, first round of panel conversations. It'd be really interesting to hear your perspective, sir. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'm with Singapore Power. We are a networks company. We're into electricity networks, gas networks, cooling networks. In fact, the air conditioning in this room is provided through a series of chilled water pipes that runs underground within the whole Marina Bay. So we're into cooling networks. We're also increasingly into a little bit of communication networks because of smart grid applications. So I just wanted to I think, touch on several points with regard to access. I do agree with the other panelists that increasingly off-grid solution, especially for rural areas, would be the quickest way to get energy to the consumer. And this does not apply only in developing countries, but I think it also applies in developed countries. Let me give you an example. We are invested in Australia. Right? We have got some customers that are in remote areas. Every kilometers you can have 1 or 2 customers, and it costs a lot of money to bring the wire to their place. And even in the bushfire season, the wires are to be blamed for causing fires. So in those situations, the off-grid solution actually could do very well. And increasingly, because of the availability, economically available storage solutions, the intermittency issue of off-grid solutions can be dealt with. So that is a key area that we are researching and watching very carefully, storage, when it comes to providing access and integrating renewables and distributed generation. So that's one area to talk about. The other key dimension from a private sector perspective, from an industry perspective, is I would call this, other than storage, the second S, which is sharing. Sharing in a broad sense. What do I mean? there is the sharing at the micro level, whereby within a certain small geographic area, you could be sharing your contingency. For instance, between two buildings, each of these buildings do not need their own backup generators. You just need one, right? And you can imagine if you multiply that, that will be, the sharing would lower costs dramatically. But even in the access context and in a macro context, I could use this example. A few years ago when I met with my counterpart in China, State Grid, the president of State Grid, and they look after 26 provinces. To State Grid, Singapore Power is a microgrid. So, and what he said actually kept ringing in my mind when it comes to this issue about sharing and allocation, effectively, of resources. He said that China, for many years, they imported crude, they refined them at the refineries, and they take the diesel to put into trains in order for the trains to transport the coal from inland China to coastal China and burn them in power plants. So there is a huge misallocation of resources in that sense. And that's why they decided that why don't we pioneer the research in high voltage, direct current transmission. By doing that, you cut losses down to single digits. Yeah. And by doing that, they generate power at the source of the coal to send it, the electrons, to the demand centers at the coastal areas instead of using diesel to transport coal. So in that sense, having interconnection at the macro level still makes sense to enable sharing. Having interconnection at the micro level still makes sense to also enable sharing. Let me go back to the micro level. Why is Uber and Airbnb making such a big difference in the technology world, in the lifestyle of, certainly in the urban setting? Because they effectively match demand and supply using the technology platform. With more technology being available, for instance, smart metering, with consumers having been empowered to be able to make choices, the effect of sharing could be huge in terms of reducing costs and providing availability, right? So that in the urban setting, in a more developed setting, but also in a remote setting. So when people cross this, once you cross the road of having access to electricity, and I agree with the panelists again that when you don't have power, even if it is expensive power, you take it. Even if it is maybe a little bit dirty, you take it first. But once you have gotten the power, then you want reliability. And that's the journey that Singapore has gone through. From the point where our mission, Singapore Power's mission, is to enhance the quality of life of Singaporeans. And in the early stages of nation building, we provided access to power. So with a fridge, you no longer have to do marketing every day. With television, you get to communicate, so the quality of life has improved. And once you get to that stage, what you want is reliability. And the reliability in a microgrid or off-grid setting could be improved dramatically with interconnection. So that's where I'm coming from in terms of talking about sharing. So storage and sharing. And in order to accelerate this access, I think enabling policy and regulatory framework is very important. And very often, one thing I want to point out is that because in many countries we have an incumbent utility company that's a national utility company, right? And some of them, like Malaysia, has done tremendously well. In some other countries, the incumbent actually is also the owner of generation. Mm-hmm. So they see this issue of renewables eating into their revenue and cannibalizing them. And because of that, they put up resistance. So a policy framework that reduces or mitigates the effect of that resistance is important. A regulation framework that enables consumer to put in place solutions that they choose to have is important. So Mr. Iswaran spoke about competition as one of the policy directions that Singapore has adopted all along. Competition in a positive, in a generic sense, to enable consumers to choose. I think that is something that will help improve access. Now, I want to end by also having the other perspective. When we say regulation to enable consumers to put up their own off-grid solutions, we should also enable the incumbent utility to do the same. Because at the end of the day, at some level of interconnection and maturity of the networks, the sharing benefits comes in. If I can shave the peak in a network and consistently do that, then I no longer need to plan infrastructure for network assets based on the peak load. And who is in the best position to do that? The incumbent who has actually access to every household. So enabling the consumer to put up their own solutions, but also not inhibiting the incumbent from providing the same solution or a slightly different solution, perhaps at its own way, and maybe most likely at a cheaper cost to the consumer, allowing the choice, I think would provide a level playing field. In the end, the objective, I think we can all agree, is to enhance the quality of life of the consumer, providing access sustainably, cost-effectively.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think that was a great way to end this first round, because I think you introduced a number of key concepts, and I think empowering the consumer, empowering the incumbents and empowering a demand-side management, which gives you optimal capacity. And I think what's interesting is also what we are already beginning to see, but we should expect to see more, which is a sort of revolution in the super efficiency of the things that people use once they've got power. Potentially allows us to reach a lot more people with less power and fulfill their needs and aspirations much better than we do today. So there's a lot going on. When I listen to the panel, I have 1,000 questions about the word cost, because frankly I think you as the audience should be challenging these guys, because they're bandying it around in various different ways, right? So cost is what you measure, and I think that in a world where nobody's really set a very good level playing field for renewables, let alone for distributed renewables, then yeah, maybe they're going to be, depending on what you're measuring, more expensive than grid-connected solutions. So I'm sure some of you have got answers, and you can fill us in on how you do your math. Secondly, Fatih, you poo-pooed carbon pricing yesterday at lunch when we were eating our chicken, whereas I don't think anybody in this room is going to make any value judgments about short-term decisions that countries have to make about new power generation. I think helping people think through the true costs of those decisions is something that the international community should do, and then we can talk about how to pay for things. And then I thought you made a very good point, however, focusing in on cooking, and I think again we go back to cost. If a woman's time is not valued by herself, or by her family, or by her community, then non-clean cooking has zero cost, right? Because, well, it's just 5 hours of her time a day, or 43 hours a week spent trying to collect dung or wood or biomass to cook. And it's only when that starts to change, both in the mindset of the community, the individual, and for the government, as has been the case in India, that you start to see rapid progress in being able to close that clean cooking gap. So these guys are going to get an opportunity to respond to all of that, but we're going to open the floor up for questions, because you're going to be a much tougher audience than I am a moderator. We have some very helpful people with microphones. Yes, absolutely. So I'd like you to put your hands up if you'd like to ask a question. I'd like you to say who you are and where you're coming from, what your designation is, and we'll get this conversation going. I'd like to take 1, 2, 3 questions. If your question's specifically for one member of the panel, say so. Otherwise, I'll let anybody answer on any point. So, any questions from the audience? Yes, there's a gentleman there. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Jaya Wahono from Indonesian Chamber of Commerce. As you are aware, Indonesia is the biggest archipelago in the world, 17,000 islands. about 8,000 to 9,000 inhabited. Energy access is very important for us, but however, we are not represented here. So hopefully next time, Sustainably for All, IEA, and this forum also invite Indonesian representative. The subsidy for fossil fuel in Indonesia costs us about 3% of our GDP, and also energy access that is not reliable, causing service disruption, costing us about 7% of GDP. So I think energy access is important, wherever that is being discussed here, and share the policy making decision, the best practice. Indonesia should be the biggest beneficiary. Thank you.
No, thank you, and thank you very much for bringing that to our attention. We'll raise that with SCAP, who hosts the panel. But I think that the progress that Indonesia's made on fossil fuel subsidy reform is something that's getting a lot of recognition now. So I think that thank you very much for making that point. While the panel are thinking, there you go, gentleman over there, and then I'll.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Tim from KPMG and I work in our energy sector. I'm not an auditor, but quite interested by what Fatty said about measurement. And, you know, when I try and find measurements on this, you know, it's not really in one place. So the question is, who should be taking the lead on some of this measurement, providing the barometers around energy access? And should it be the UN? You know, when I see things, you know, I think loss of GDP has been mentioned, but you also see other barometers, you know, like infant mortality, lifespan, all of these things. And I think the reason China has done so well is they look at this holistically. So kind of, yeah, the question is kind of, you know, what are the barometers and who should be taking responsibility for providing those barometers and keeping us all up to date?
Good question. Any more questions? In which case, yeah, the gentleman over there. And then we'll go back to the panel.
Okay, my name is Harish Pandian. I'm a student from Singapore. And actually I have a concern looking at developing countries. Okay, if you talk about off-grid solutions, I feel that developing countries will be a hinder for them if you use off-grid like solar power or that, because it might not be strong or it might not be actually possible for them to develop more. And so what I was thinking is that, is it possible for wireless power distribution? Talking about, you know, because since we are students, we have done some research talking about Tesla coils and stuff like that. Is it possible to do distribution of power using wireless? So that if just say if a country were to be very big, like India or China, I think wireless distribution can reach quite far using magnetic field and forces like that. Yeah. So that's the question I have.
Okay. So, I mean, anybody in the panel want to comment on Indonesia's progress and maybe on subsidy reform in general? And then there's a question about measurement and a question about whether there are other technological solutions at hand. Maybe over to you.
Can I say something first on the fossil fuel subsidy reform? Because it seems to me that no one, or at least no one reasonably would disagree with what Fatty said, that actually for a developing country, electricity is the first and the last need. Yeah. And that is absolutely crucial. And from there, there's then perhaps a hierarchy, and we can argue or discuss what that hierarchy is beyond that first tier need. But what is also true is if we say that some of those other values are important, and it goes to your point, I think, Rachel, that we have to have the cost here, or at least the actual cost. And it seems to me that in many cases we aren't. I think fossil fuel subsidies and reform, I think it was Dr. Shahshad Akhtar who mentioned $250 billion in inefficient subsidies in this region alone. So I just celebrate what Indonesia is doing. I know India is as well. But if we haven't got that true cost, that real level playing field where we're factoring, or at least we're getting rid of the distortions, the misallocations, I think that is a very real problem. Can I just also say on that regard, of course, in doing that, it's not just a question of the financial, it's also, I think the Singapore Power gentleman here has made a very good point. It's also about the regulatory systems and the way they can favour, for historic reasons, albeit at the time when they were set up, good reasons, a certain way of doing things, arguably, for example, non-renewables over renewables. And in that regulatory settings space as well, we also need to ensure that we have level playing fields.
Fatty.
Okay, I will mention two very small things. First of all, the question about Indonesia. First of all, Indonesia may not be here, but Indonesia is here because Indonesia is also an associate member of the IEA, and when IEA is here, it means Indonesia is here, so you can be tranquil, so don't worry about that. So now, one thing about the fossil fuel subsidies. Many politicians, and I had these discussions with the several Indonesian ministers, and some of them made major efforts, to be honest with you. The idea is fossil fuel subsidies protect the poor is completely wrong. We made an analysis. It shows that today we have about 500 billion US dollar fossil fuel subsidies worldwide. More than 80% of the subsidies protect the higher and medium income level groups. Less than 20% helps only to the lowest income groups. So subsidies are in fact helping the medium and higher income level groups rather than the poorer ones. On top of that, the money goes from the budget of the government for the subsidies could have been spent for hospitals, schools, bridges, roads, and the lower income groups are not having access to that as they are not built because of the money goes to subsidies. So the issue, the point, the argument that the subsidies help the poor is completely wrong. So I wanted to mention this. This is number one. Number two, once again, I want to come to the issue of carbon pricing. It is very important to understand this. Carbon pricing is an excellent instrument, perhaps the best instrument to reduce the emissions. However, just pushing this argument may not be very productive, as in the short and even medium term, the practicability, if it is a right expression in English, practicability of introducing a global carbon price, the chances are not very high. So we should put all our stakes on an option which is very difficult to have a global implementation. It is what I am saying, and I think what I am saying is very clear. Third point, on the KPMG team's question, a measurement. You have to measure the things, and you have to track the things. What the governments are saying, right or wrong, what they promise, somebody has to keep an eye on that. We, as the IEA, we are looking at only on the energy side. Electricity access, country X, on-grid, off-grid, we look at all of them each year, and what is the success or failure each year, and also for the cooking I mentioned, this is also very important. But Tim is right, it should be also looked from a broader angle, from the economic gains, for example, from the health point of view. I think UN, WHO is working on that. This should be all look in that one context, Rachel.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just wanted to pick on the concept of sharing that Wong mentioned. I think there's a real opportunity there, especially at the regional level. And we in ASEAN, we have been talking about the Asian power grid, and we have this Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore. The last ASEAN ministers meeting, we have signed the MOU. Singapore has requested for a bit more delayed process on their side because of market mechanism for the quota 100 megawatt. Okay? But we were seeing it as a real model reducing costs, decarbonizing the economy. Malaysia, we're excited about it because long term we're looking at importation of power from Laos, which is coming from hydro. They say they can have 30 to 50,000 meg available in terms of the potential. Sorting out the wheeling charges from Thailand side. Our planting up in Malaysia, we have about 23,000 megawatt in the mainland here. Now it is 52% gas and about 42% coal. In 10 years' time, based on our planting up, it's going to be the reverse, because I express concern on coal and so forth. But these are the realities. But with this kind of opening, if the wheeling charges we are talking to Thailand is reasonable, and it's cheaper for us to import renewable hydro from Laos, then some of the plants that are due for repowering, which is coal based on prices, the most acceptable inputs, then we can reduce that. We can reduce carbon emission even at that level. So I think we need to spur this. With Indonesia, we have a Bukit Asam Sumatra project, 600 meg, eventually going to 1,200 at mine's mouth. It's quite advanced now, and the idea there was import power during the day because our demand is peak in the afternoon, and in Indonesia it is a night time. A mechanism already in place, Sarawak and Pontianak, Kalimantan, West Kalimantan, 110 meg being exported every day from Sarawak to Pontianak. So they are pioneering concepts and action, I think, which can be further wide. So that one is a carbon issue, two is the sharing of technologies, and at the end of the day, also the idea of sharing the context of renewables. So I think we need to pay attention to that and assist where the international community can assist. Yeah.
Thank you. Should we go back to the audience? Other questions?
Well, Rachel,
Oh, no, please.
perhaps
Sir, thank you.
there's a question that was unanswered.
Okay.
But just on measurement, the only input that I may have is perhaps, again, we need to look at it from a consumer's perspective. We are trying to bring them access, cheap, reliable, sustainable power. So we need to be measuring it in those dimensions from the consumer's perspective. Yeah. To say that we have got 100% connectivity, and yet people are not using the power, is not meaningful. So I think a combination of measurements, including the cost of the power, the load factor, how much is it being used, those from the consumer's perspective, instead of from the producer's perspective. I think that's my input to that. With regard to wireless transmission, we have, with the support of the ministry, as well as the EDB and EMA, we have a center of excellence where we test out new innovative network solutions. So I appreciate your passion in wireless, in network solutions. Perhaps you can work together with us to sort out some of the safety issues, some of the technical issues, some of the scaling up issues. At today, it is not quite mature enough to get to that point. Right.
Well, I just wanted to mention one about costs. When you don't have electricity, most of people are willing to pay whatever it takes. I mean, this is an example from India where in some places per unit costs are almost 19 rupees. Now, I remember, I'm just sharing something with you. I remember the days in Delhi, so would Fatih, so would I think Patricia, or when the supply to Delhi was of very poor quality. I mean, you really had long breakdowns, disruptions, etc. And the running feedback at that time was that it doesn't matter if they charge us even double, as long as they give us reliable power. Well, that's happened, true. Our power supply position in Delhi, if you visited it recently, is 24/7. It's excellent. But the rates have gone up, and now everybody is critical about the rates. So, once you get it, it becomes a very big issue. Till you don't have it, you're willing, and you're going to pay whatever it takes. That's number one. The second thing about measurement and this thing is, maybe I should let the cat amongst the pigeons. There is a measurement that IEA as well as everybody makes in terms of per capita units of consumption. Now, could there be some kind of a measurement where we'd say, like the UN, WHO says it, that 1,000 calories for persons living in the northern hemisphere between above so-and-so latitude or longitude would need so many calories. Can we not develop something like this where we say, per capita? I mean, it's just a thought. I mean,
No.
we're talking about measurement, and I thought this, of course, Fatih would have a different